Hello learners, welcome to this lecture on George Eliot's Middlemarch. Today we will begin with books 1 and 2. Book 1 is titled Miss Brooke and book 2 is titled Old and Young. And in this lecture we will be focusing on some of the issues that are raised in these two books. Here, as you can see, is a picture of the first page of Middlemarch Volume 1. Now, the novel Middlemarch is subtitled A Study of Provincial Life. And when you read this novel, when you look at the different issues and analyze them, you must keep in mind that it is a novel that focuses on provincial life. The novel was broadly written over 1871 to 1872, and George Eliot started writing it somewhere around 1869, and it's published around this time, and it is placed back in time in the years preceding the first Reform Bill of 1832. And the point that I'm making here is that a novel that is written around 1871, 1872 focuses on a time period that is some decades back, and this is just before the first Reform Bill of 1832. So, George Eliot writes about the protagonist, as a young doctor, and at the same time, she also writes, one can say, something that is a part of this novel, which is titled Miss Brooke. And these two aspects actually form an integral part and very majorly the first part of the novel. These two fragments, one on the young doctor and one which is titled Miss Brooke, these are brought together, and we look at these different moments, really speaking, in the lives of these two, in terms of one can call them protagonists, primary characters, but then there is a lot more that is happening in Middlemarch. If you look at the way Dorothea or Miss Brooke is described in the novel, she mentions, George Eliot mentions how Dorothea knew many passages of Pascal's Pensées and of Jeremy Taylor by heart, and she could not reconcile the anxieties of a spiritual life involving eternal consequences with the keen interest in crimp and artificial protrusions of drapery. Her mind was theoretic and yearned by its nature after some lofty conception of the world. And this, in a sense, becomes our point of entry into the novel. The fact that we are looking at a protagonist whose mind was theoretic. What does George Eliot mean? Is she paying Dorothea a compliment? Is she paying her character, presenting her as somebody who has the potential of thinking about, of imagining, and a lofty conception of the world? Yet, the fact that it was theoretic also means that somewhere it was not amenable to praxis, that somewhere the practical application of her ideas was problematic. So, and she continues in the same train by saying that which might frankly include the parish of Tipton and her own rule of conduct. So, which means that Dorothea is going to implement this idea of the world on her own life. And, if we really speaking, try and understand this, we are really looking at, a protagonist, a character who wants to imagine the world around her in a certain way. Now, on the one hand, that says a lot about George Eliot's imagination in creating a woman character who seeks to kind of establish, and has a certain potential, really speaking, of imagining the world in a certain way. But yet that has its limitations. With this, we move to an understanding of the prelude. And in the prelude, she's compared directly with Saint Teresa. And Saint Teresa is, forms the backdrop for the character of Dorothea. And Saint Teresa being a, 16th century Carmelite nun, Saint Teresa of Avila, and somebody who practiced a very simple life, almost one can say an austere life, that involved deep contemplation. So this, really speaking, is the model for Dorothea Brooke. And this comparison, really speaking, is very, very important. Now, the prelude itself, and in a sense the beginning of the novel, states, "Who that cares much to know the history of man and how the mysterious mixture behaves under the varying experiments of time, has not dwelt, at least briefly, on the life of Saint Teresa, has not smiled with some gentleness at the thought of the little girl walking forth one morning, hand in hand with her still smaller brother, to go and seek martyrdom in the country of the Moors." So it's important that the image of Saint Teresa is evoked right at the beginning of the novel. So the word history is very important here, and what we are really looking at is the history of man. But what is important is that those who have thought about history, she says, have probably not dwelt on the life of Saint Teresa. So Saint Teresa, in a sense, is the model for an important character in the novel, that is Dorothea Brooke. And here I quote from the novel, "Many Teresas have been born who found for themselves no epic life wherein there was a constant unfolding of far resonant action, perhaps only a life of mistakes, the offspring of a certain spiritual grandeur, ill-matched with the meanness of opportunity, perhaps a tragic failure which found no sacred poet and sank unwept into oblivion." So many Teresas have been born. So on the one hand, the female protagonist, in a sense, if I can use the word protagonist here, being Dorothea Brooke, is modeled on Saint Teresa. And yet, at the same time, what George Eliot says here is that many Teresas have been born who found for themselves no epic life. So on the one hand, the fact that we still remember Saint Teresa means that there is something significant that she had done. And yet, at the same time, this idea of becoming Saint Teresa did not translate into a reality of an epic life, of the unfolding of far resonant action. And instead, what one has is a life of mistakes, the offspring of a certain spiritual grandeur that is ill-matched. So, right at the beginning, words like tragic failure and so on are used, which make us think about the way in which, not only of course about Dorothea Brooke, about what is this character really going to turn out to be, but at the same time, it also points towards the way in which a narrative is being weaved by George Eliot herself. So here is another excerpt from the text, and I will just read out a very important line in this particular excerpt from the prelude, which is that here and there a cygnet is reared uneasily among the ducklings in the brown pond, and never finds the living stream in fellowship with its own hoary-footed kind. Here and there is born a Saint Teresa, foundress of nothing, whose loving heart beats and sobs after an unattained goodness. Right, so what are we looking at? We are looking at a character modeled on Saint Teresa. Now, who is she? The comparison is now with the cygnet reared uneasily among the ducklings, right? And Saint Teresa, who of course she founded many convents and so on, but George Eliot says, here and there is born a Saint Teresa, foundress of nothing. The desire to attain a lofty aim, but something that does not translate into practice. So, Miss Brooke is described in words that make us think, who is she? Is she a Saint Teresa? Is she a cygnet? Is she a foundress of nothing? I mean, she has the kind of beauty that is thrown into relief only by poor dress. And yet, at the same time, the fact that this female protagonist is already sketched out for us, the boundaries in a sense have already been described. And then, one of the most important institutions of the 19th century, and something that I think the women writers delved into very in great detail, was the institution of marriage. And the 19th century woman writer particularly looked at how the characters are actually negotiating, in a sense, with the institution of marriage. Now, what does the institution of marriage mean in this novel? Something that's extremely important and, has been portrayed in a very, very realistic manner. So, how should Dorothea not marry a girl so handsome and with such prospects? So, she's a handsome girl. How is it that she could not marry? The very fact that marriage, in that sense, is supposed to be, the final step, in a sense, in the realization of what she wants. But her love of extremes, her insistence on regulating life according to notions that might cause a weary man to hesitate, she says, might lead her at last to refuse all offers. So Dorothea, with all her eagerness to know the truths of life, she had very childlike ideas about marriage. She almost thought that, George Eliot, of course, says that, she would have accepted the judicious hooker if she had been born in time to save him from the wretched mistake he made in matrimony, or John Milton when, his blindness had come on. So she, in a sense, wants to be totally dedicated to a lofty aim, and marriage, the institution of marriage, is going to be, a step towards the same. Now, there is this very interesting episode in the novel where, the two sisters, that's Dorothy and Celia, they have the mother's jewels, and Celia, of course, Celia, in that sense, is shown to be the prototype for what would be considered to be, a normal within quotes, person who would want to wear all these jewels and so on. And knowing her sister's temperament, knowing Dorothea's temperament, she believes that probably Dorothea would want to kind of wear a cross. And so she says, however, a cross is the last thing that she would want to wear as a trinket. And Dorothea says that, well, this would look nice on you. And instead, she chooses another piece of jewelry. And she says something very interesting here. She says that souls have complexion too. Right? So what does it mean? It means that she understands the fact of the realization of a very austere life means something for her, and wearing the cross as a trinket, really speaking, totally devalues the cross itself. So, if you look at the suitors, really speaking, at the beginning of the novel, we are looking at Sir James Chatham, and we are looking at the Reverend Edward Casaubon. Now, Sir James Chatham would actually speaking, he would be the conventional suitor. And Sir James Chatham and, in a sense, the ideal marriage, would it be with the Reverend Edward Casaubon or with Sir James Chatham? Think about it. So, when one reads the novel in the normal course of things, look at it from the perspective of Celia. And Celia says that, how is it that you can refuse Sir James Chatham, and she herself likes Sir James Chatham quite a bit, and marry somebody like Edward Casaubon? So where one fits into the conventional trope of marriage, the other actually projects an ideal to Dorothea. And what is this ideal? This ideal is her understanding of her role in marriage. And even marriage, in that sense, is to be a struggle, really speaking. So, it seems more likely, as is referred to in the novel, as a sacrificial wish. So, where Celia finds Edward Casaubon practically ugly, he appears in a very different light to Dorothea's imagination. It had now entered Dorothea's mind, and I'm quoting from the novel, that Mr. Casaubon might wish to make her his wife, and the idea that he would do so touched her with a sort of reverential gratitude. How good of him! Nay, it would be almost as if a winged messenger had suddenly stood beside her path and held out his hand towards her. So, what does Dorothea think about the institution of marriage? Come to think of it, she really speaking doesn't have any thoughts. But for her, marriage is a way of realizing her lofty aims about living in the world. And she thinks that here is Mr. Casaubon, who's, of course, there is a possibility that, he might become bishop later. And somebody who's totally dedicated to learning. But what is Dorothea's role in all this? She experiences what she calls reverential gratitude. So, is marriage going to be based on gratitude? And it's almost as if she sees him like this angel who stood beside her path and, has actually is going to lead her to that idea of a realization of the lofty aim in life. So, if you look at the authorial tone in these lines, we can clearly see how the author narrator is really speaking in telling the story about Dorothea Brooke, is also clearly undercutting the female protagonist's imaginations as reverential, right? And is drawing attention to the fact that, it takes you back actually to the very first comment that her mind is theoretic. So even when she thinks about marriage, her ideas, her opinions are in a sense very, very theoretical. Her plans for the second aspect about Dorothea Brooke, which is very important, and you need to keep that in mind, students, which is her plans for the cottages. Now, if you look at it, her plans for the cottages are at one level very unreal. And yet, at the same time, they are real in material, because if they translate into reality, then we are looking at better houses and better cottages, better habitation for the ordinary people. So where James Chetham tries to win her favor by talking about the houses, we must note here that Casaubon pays practically little or no attention to her plans. It's almost as if the only thoughts that exist, the only aims that exist, have to be those of Casaubon. So, but it is the one distinguishing aspect to Dorothea. And, we see that she also reads Loudon's book, which is on contemporary landscape, the way landscape was to be done, even though Cecilia calls it a fad. Interestingly, Cecilia, sits back there almost as outsider, observing her sister. So she calls this a fad, whereas she looks at it very seriously. Now, what I have before you is actually an image of the title of Loudon's book. And you can see how this also shows how George Eliot was absolutely aware of the way in which landscaping was being done. And she endows her female protagonist with the potential of thinking and of looking at literature so that she can realize her aim of the cottages. So in fact, Dorothea goes on to say that, this is not just worth doing. She says, and I quote her, "I think we deserve to be beaten out of our beautiful houses with the scourge of small cords. All of us who let tenants live in such sites as we see round us. Life in cottages might be happier than ours if they were real houses fit for human beings from whom we expect duties and affections." Now, this is a very important point here, because on the one hand, we see Dorothea has, she's critical of the fact that some people get to live in these big, beautiful houses, whereas people who work for them, the tenants, are living in such are living in insufferable conditions. And she says that actually life in cottages could be happier than their own. So on the one hand, she does have, probably this sense of nostalgia of a time gone by. But at the same time, these lines draw attention to her desire for establishing some sense of equality in the world around her. But the idea is good, but Dorothea Brooke probably does not have that kind of training, and then lacks the potential to actually translate it into practice. And in her marriage with Edward Casaubon, this idea also gets left behind, and at some stage she does realize that. So here is another quotation that from the text. You can take a look at this. So we look at the two suitors, and she very clearly says that she does not wish to have a husband her own age. She says that marriage, she considers it to be a state of higher duties, And in fact, what Mrs. Cadwallader says is very interesting. She says that, you should not marry someone with a great soul. So, in a sense, Mrs. Cadwallader is somebody who's looking at things, from the point of view of the real world, really speaking, something that Dorothea Brooke, really speaking, lacks, even though, of course, she's the one who's trying to fix all sorts of matches in the society. Sir James Chatham too feels that Dorothea Brooke does not know what she wants in life. And so she says that, and I quote Dorothea here, "I know that I must expect trials, uncle. Marriage is a state of higher duties. I never thought of it as mere personal ease." So it's almost as if Dorothea now wants all the decisions to be taken for her after she has taken this one decision of who she is going to marry. And Casaubon, of course, is very conscious of the difference in age and the fact that, he is marrying a woman who's younger. And which is why each time there is a reference to another character in this novel, and a very important character at that, Will Ladislaw, who is, his cousin and almost appears to be his nephew. He keeps on, he reiterates time and again that this is my cousin, you mean, not my nephew. So, at the same time, apart from these characters, apart from this very dismal marriage that Dorothea Brooke gets into, we are also given a glimpse of the society of Middlemarch. And who is Ladislaw? Will Ladislaw. Please mark the development of Will Ladislaw, and we will be discussing Will Ladislaw in greater detail in the lectures that follow. So he's both insider and outsider. Outsider who's brought in, and one realizes towards the end of the novel his connections with Middlemarch society. He is at all times critical of the system itself and represents, in a sense, the new currents in time. If we look at the society of Middlemarch, take a look at this line. It gives us everything. There was the newly elected mayor of Middlemarch, who happened to be a manufacturer, the philanthropic banker, his brother-in-law, who predominated so much in the town that some called him a Methodist, others a hypocrite, according to the resources of their vocabulary, and there were various professional men. So, look at political representation. These are the years before the Reform Bill. And who is the elected mayor? He's a manufacturer. The manufacturer is connected to the philanthropic banker. Right? So, look at how it is these people, the middle class is very important in the 19th century. The reason you have 3 reform bills that come in the 19th century is because now political representation for the ordinary person is very, very important. And this aspect of 19th century society, this aspect of history, is very clearly etched out in the novel. So the 2 stories, that is one of Dorothea and Casaubon, and of course that extends to Ladislaw later, and there is another story that is brought in, which is that of the medical doctor, the young medical doctor Tertius Lydgate. And Lydgate, in any case, is introduced to us along with another character whom, of course, he is going to marry later, that is Rosamond Vincy. And he's already smitten, he looks at her and he says that she's grace itself. And she's perfectly lovely and accomplished. Now, who is the accomplished woman really? What does it mean to be an accomplished woman? I think Jane Austen in her novels has discussed this in great detail. And so, plain women he regarded as he did the other severe facts of life. So, and he's totally charmed in a sense by Rosamond Vincy. She has all the attributes. Let's take a look at her attributes. She was admitted, I quote from the novel, she was admitted to be the flower of Mrs. Lemon's school, the chief school in the country where the teaching included all that was demanded in the accomplished female. Right? So she's propriety, the mental acquisition, propriety of speech, musical execution. So, these are the things that draw attention. And when we look at Lydgate, what does he want to do? He too, unlike Rosamond Vincy, but exactly like Dorothea Brooke, he too has an aim. And the aim is to do something for society. And his aim is that of medical reform. What does he want to do? He wants to set up a fine fever hospital in addition to the old infirmary. And that might be, he thinks, the nucleus of a medical school here. So the reform is in the field of medical education and for the society in terms of curing people. So this is the idealism with which Lydgate enters Middlemarch society. In a sense, he comes from outside and wants to bring about reform here. So what is George Eliot really saying about reform? And he says that, his profession itself, it wanted reform and gave a man an opportunity for some indignant resolve to reject its decorations and other humbling. So he wanted to demonstrate, and this is a very important aspect of Lydgate. One, for instance, he wanted to demonstrate the intimate relations of the living structure, the primitive tissue. What was the primitive tissue, really speaking? And come to think of it, when we look at Edward Casaubon, what does he want to do? He wants to write a book about the primitive mythologies, right? And so over here, we are looking at primitive tissue, but here, this is in the field of education. And so he counted on quiet intervals to be watchfully seized for taking up threads of investigation, his use of the scalpel, the reference to the microscope. This also tells you how familiar George Eliot herself was in terms of the developments and new inventions, everything from the microscope and the use of the scalpel and so on. The fact of, the fact that we are talking about a medical person in this novel. And yet, this man who has these lofty aims also has what very beautifully an oft-quoted phrase from this novel is Lydgate's spots of commonness lay in the complexion of his prejudices. And there was something that made him behave in the most ordinary of way. Call it the human element, call it his spots of commonness, call it behaving like the ordinary person. But this is what prevents him from translating his ideas of medical reform completely into practice. So in a sense, two very important characters, Dorothea Brooke and Tertius Lydgate, and both in a sense, are theoretical minds in very different ways, because one is rooted in the field of medicine and the other, of course, in terms of her idea of reform. But both, in a sense, are they able to, let me pose it as a question, are they able to translate this into the real life, so to say? He did not, if you look at these lines, so lay in the complexion of his prejudices, which in spite of noble intention and sympathy were half of them such as are found in the ordinary men of the world. So something that makes him behave like all the ordinary people. Which means that, in a sense, despite all these aims, he's unable to, really speaking, transcend the spots of commonness. That distinction of mind that belonged to his intellectual ardor did not penetrate his feeling about furniture or women. And it is this, his relationship to Rosamond Vincy, in a sense, that kind of, makes him behave probably in the most ordinary of ways. And here I will quote W.J. Harvey, who says, at the heart of the book we have the stories of Dorothea and Lydgate, twin studies in defeated aspiration. Dorothea is the innocent idealist, anxious to do great good in a world which cramps and confines her. Lydgate, who aims to combine the reform of medical practice with basic research, is also trapped into a stultifying union with the shallowly egoistic Rosamond Vincy, his ambitions withering under the pressure of provincial narrowness. With this, I come towards the close of this particular lecture and request you to take a close look at the way in which these characters have developed. And always keep in mind the fact that George Eliot is writing, in a sense, she uses this male pseudonym, but is writing, fearlessly, depicting in a very realistic mode about society. And, Gilbert and Gubar have said how for the 19th century woman writer who tried to transcend her anxiety of authorship, this idea of the use of the pseudonym provided, maybe it was inevitable, but it provided a way to, actually speaking, really speak about these important issues. So Lee Edwards also says how Middlemarch is a novel about imaginative energy, and in the next lecture we will be talking a little bit more about this imaginative energy and the power in this novel. The book is neither tragic nor comic, but Edwards says it is simply realistic. Thank you.